There's no chance of a 1860s style war between the states. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a large scale civil war or civil war-like conflict in North America. In order to do that, you just have to continue to double down on the horrific war created by George W. Bush and Felipe Calderón back in 2006 and 2007. This ongoing narco war that has killed 300,000 people to date.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast.
Hello, Rory.
Hello, Rob. How have you been this week?
Not bad, not bad. Excited to do part 2 of our discussion on Mexico, where we, as promised, go off-piste a little.
A little less factual than usual, but still insightful.
Yeah, we're gonna go super speculative here. I've noticed that most geopolitics people get successful by essentially talking science fiction. So let's try and do that a little bit. I want to talk about Mexico and the Second North American Civil War.
Okay. That sounds horrific. Let's hope that doesn't happen.
People in the United States are obsessed by the idea of a new American Civil War. Marjorie Taylor Greene is famously tweeting about it. This is a congressperson talking about a national divorce, what have you. I have long found these discussions ridiculous, sort of trotted up by various media organizations, obsessions with antagonism or what have you. Basically, if you just look into it with simple critical thinking, it's really hard to imagine states where I don't think there's any state where more than 65% of the people in that state vote in one direction or another. It's more famously folks leaning left and urban will talk about how Red America would be lost without Blue America, but it's also true that Blue America would be lost without Red America. There's no chance of a 1860s style war between the states. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a large scale civil war or civil war-like conflict in North America. In order to do that, you just have to continue to double down on the horrific war created by George W. Bush and Felipe Calderón back in 2006 and 2007. This ongoing narco war that has killed 300,000 people to date and could, if the recommendations of more insane people from the Republican Party to the New York Times were to be followed. And if we were to continue to double down on militarizing this narco war, it's easy for me, somewhat sleep deprived, to imagine a true Second North American Civil War with the United States versus Mexico, with the drug war as the inciting event.
So how does a civil war in America affect Mexico?
Well, that's sort of the thing that I tend to think of the United States as a lot more powerful than other folks do. With the full knowledge that when the United States sticks its face into a buzzsaw, as we tend to do repeatedly, we get burned. But my experience this century is that our sticking our face into the Middle East buzzsaw ended up hurting everybody else a lot worse than it hurt us. So to speculate here, I want to talk about how the horrific catastrophe of a U.S. intervention in Mexico might actually end up, in the very long term, consolidating in the U.S.'s favor. So, and I think hopefully in the process I can dissuade a lot of folks from engaging in this, because a lot of the folks who seem to want to invade Mexico also seem to hate Mexicans.
Are they weirdly pro-Russian by any chance?
I couldn't tell you. There's the taxonomy there. It's hard to tell. But I think what folks have to realize is that a U.S. invasion of Mexico has the potential to spiral out of control in a truly, truly horrific way, to the extent where I think you would be talking about the Second North American Civil War wouldn't actually be a war internal to the United States. It would be the aggressive U.S. war against Mexico. And that the result of that could actually end up being the U.S. annexing significant parts of Mexico. I wouldn't think it would be straightforwardly as states. There'd probably be some other governing structure that would be established.
Like a vassal state nearly?
We've already got it, is the thing. People don't realize how far the process of consolidation between the United States, Mexico, and Canada already has gone. There's certain really obvious sort of broad consumer-facing things that we don't do, like the European Union does free travel. Shockingly, in the period of time that NAFTA and USMC been in place, we've actually gone really far in the direction against free travel. We've actually made travel more difficult between the countries in some ways.
Even though some experts believe it's a great way of keeping, America's population young and growing.
Oh, yeah, very true, very true. But those experts, and I think many other experts, would be correct in pointing out that the economic integration between the United States, Mexico, and Canada over the past 30 years has been, in some ways, much more successful than European economic integration.
It might be better. European integration might be better as a whole, while the NAFTA one might be much better for, America. I feel it's getting the spoils.
I think that's probably true, Rory. That's probably true. And that's got to do with the dynamics between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA has facilitated a massive buying up of Mexican property by U.S. retirees. It's not been as easy for Mexicans to move to the United States in many cases. I think the contrast between the EU and the United States is just how much more powerful the United States is than its NAFTA partners. I think that the EU is often characterized as being Germany's plaything or something like that, and that's just...
More so France, I think. But yeah. But I remember when Brexiteers were characterizing it, they'd say, France and Germany have more power than Britain, and you're like, you'd kind of hope two of the biggest nations combined would be bigger than, more powerful than one of the other nations. But it did have it had a nice balance, and there is the whole, if there's some things that are voted on that if one party doesn't agree to it, then nothing happens. So we've had Poland and Hungary for a long time protecting each other, but yes, it does seem to be what America wants, what America gets when it comes to NAFTA.
Yeah, no question. And that allows a greater degree, because it is less democratic, a little more authoritarian, that has allowed a greater degree of integration. I think one great example of the contrast between NAFTA and the European Union is that fiscal policy is a lot more straightforward. The problem with the democracy of the EU, or rather the main problem for the European Union over the past solid decade now, has been the lack of financial or banking integration. There just isn't common ground or agreement on how that's going to function, on whether Germany and other rich countries are going to adequately bail out southern countries with problems. A lot of that's shifting with COVID. Many argue that maybe those problems are resolved. But in the United States, that problem's been resolved since the 1990s. It's what the U.S. wants goes.
The almighty dollar.
Indeed. Both Mexico and Canada have their own central banks, their own fiscal policies, treasury departments, or what have you, whatever they call them. But there's no real question of them having any real impact on what the United States does.
Would it be possible, say, Mexico and Canada really wanted something and America didn't? How often does that happen, and how often would they ever achieve their goal?
It's hard for me to envision a context in which that would happen. I think that NAFTA and USMC has dramatically fewer ongoing infrastructures. That there is no pretense of democratic accountability or an EU parliament, or there's probably some kind of USMC executive of some sort, or perhaps that's just handled by the departments of commerce of the respective nations. But yeah, there is no way for Mexico or Canada to sort of band together and force the United States to do something. I think the context within which that would most likely happen would be the renegotiation that we just went through under the Trump administration. Was that Lighthizer? Probably Lighthizer. That renegotiation was Canada and Mexico's chance to force the United States into doing things. And I have no question that there were things that the U.S. Did not want, that Canada and Mexico wanted, that happened, because that's how negotiations work. But I would argue that the United States probably got more of what it wanted on balance, because that's just sort of how these things work. But simply not having the fiscal questions that the European Union has had to deal with over the past decade has meant that economic integration can go forward on a certainly less democratic and balanced level, but on a just more massive level, a more significant level, and at a level that allows economic growth to happen at a faster pace for all three of the countries. And of course, there's lots of other factors, demographics, immigration, this, that, and the other thing that make North American growth faster than European growth. But I would argue that the fact that fiscal and banking questions are just largely settled is a huge part of that.
When we're coming back to this, invade Mexico, it reminds me of America pretty much has everything it would want from Mexico without having to look after them. It doesn't have to house them. It doesn't have to educate them because it is an independent country. But there's nothing really that I could see that, if America really wanted something from Mexico that it doesn't kind of already have. But it's the best of both. You get to, put your companies there, have the cheap labor, and then you get your massive profits when you either sell them to Mexicans or to Americans. But you don't have to raise them.
Well, that's certainly the case in Taiwan, and we're working pretty hard to start a fight over that regardless. We like fights. And I think that for most Americans, the idea of conquering Mexico sounds absolutely terrible. I don't think there's any appetite for that. However, there is a growing appetite because of the war that George W. Bush and Mexican President Calderon launched in 2007. There is a growing sense that, the Mexican government can't handle this. The Mexican government, maybe they just need our help. And to be clear, I think that U.S. intervention would be horrific, would actually pretty automatically lead to a loss of life. Automatically overstates it, but would be quite likely to lead to loss of life on the level of the U.S. Civil War, hundreds of thousands. So Calderon and Bush's war that was launched in 2007 has already killed hundreds of thousands of people. And if the United States were to jump in, that war, I believe, would be guaranteed to expand to the rest of North America, to the United States. And those hundreds of thousands that would die, those numbers would start including U.S. citizens as well as Mexican citizens to a much higher degree.
I'm reminded of the conflict with Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Now that, Yemen's now gotten more military hardware, it's able to, do attacks on Saudi Arabia. I feel like something similar, like if we talk about these drug cartel people, they know how to kill people. And if, from what I've heard is, there's sort of an unwritten rule of you really try not to kill Americans. You can sort of kill a lot of Mexicans, that's fine. But once you start killing Americans, you start to get those potential special forces that are maybe there or not there. You get a lot of hate. So there is a kind of, we're going easy on you. But if there was a full-scale invasion, these people will also then be incorporated into the army because there's nothing, not a great unifier is being invaded. So suddenly people who were, on opposing sides might agree with each other. And also there will be, horrific terrorist attacks. Everything that we've seen from the Middle East will have been learnt and adapted into new horrendous ways.
Of course. And it's not just, let's remember, it's not just the Americans in the United States, as rather the U.S. citizens in the United States. It is the U.S. citizens who live in Mexico to the tunes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions upon millions, who would also be targeted. But I think that's a really key point you bring up there. And this was also referred to in the Task and Purpose video I did a critique of a week or so back. Was mentioning that the cartels are very, very present in the United States today and are very careful not to create large violence issues within the United States because they're effectively deterred. But I think what people don't understand is the limits of that deterrence. And people are just sort of assuming, the cartels are afraid of us. The cartels are afraid of us on a personal level. If the United States Special Forces were to go in on a large way, started getting all the cartels, took out whoever the heads are of these cartels, I have no doubt in my mind that the U.S. Special Forces would be more than capable of killing everybody on their list within the first 3 weeks. Maybe, well, I thought Russia would take Ukraine in 3 weeks, so who knows? And this is a very similar dynamic. But I'd have no doubt in my mind that the Special Forces would have some degree of success in killing all of those people. And the people who are in head of the current narco cartels want to avert that, and that's why they're careful not to kill Americans in the United States or U.S. citizens in the United States. But if the Special Forces were to successfully kill all these narco heads, we know what happens, because we did this in 2007, and we went from 4 cartels to 150 cartels. And if the Special Forces go in there, we go from 150 cartels to 1,000 cartels. And that deterrence, that sort of promise that we're not going to send these scary Navy SEALs after you, will have been broken. And then the remnants of these narco cartels decide that, they're being tough. No, it's time for us to be tough. And that's how you get the Second American Civil War. That's how you get a truly horrific set of situations that might not end for a decade. The first U.S. Civil War, the first North American Civil War killed 600,000 people. I could see a conflict like this killing 1 million people. I talked in the last episode about how there was an understanding through most of the 20th century that the United States could, rob the central bank of Haiti, overthrow every government in Central America. But let's be a little bit more careful with Mexico because we've got this 1,700-mile border. It was disastrous during the Mexican Revolution when the United States intervened there and ended up with an actual invasion of, I can't remember. I think it was New Mexico, not Texas. But nobody lived there. 120 years ago, nobody lived down there. Like before air conditioning, there were a few 100,000 people in New Mexico and Arizona, maybe a little bit more than that, but a few hundreds of thousands of people and a paltry millions in Texas. To launch something like this would be the height of insanity when you consider what a massive center of population that the U.S. Southwest has become. It would be, and I think this is exactly the same dynamic. It was very surprising to U.S. policymakers in the 19-teens when they couldn't get away with abusing Mexico as much as they did in the 1840s, when literally nobody lived not literally nobody. There were thousands of people who lived in this area that is now inhabited.
But nothing like it is today.
By tens of millions. So, even in the early 20th century, U.S. policymakers were shocked by how much more damaging Mexico was. And that was before we had tens of millions of people living along this border. It would just get so horrific so quickly. And you mentioned that, what conceivable use could the United States have with territorial acquisitions in Mexico? And practically speaking, the answer is nothing.
It's also the region directly opposite America is mostly desert.
True. I believe that to be true. I've driven through some of it.
So you're really having to go to, the center of Mexico, the region around Mexico City, before you're getting, the populous areas. It does seem quite just a fanciful, crazy idea.
It is a fanciful, crazy idea, but if the United States finds itself in a war, and it's worth considering just how destabilizing this massive war that a lot of Republicans and actually also Democrats like David Frum or I presume Brett Steffens, well, he probably still votes Republican, but he writes for the New York Times. This is a bipartisan suggestion, this war. This war would, even worse than a war with Iran, sort of tank U.S. international aspirations for the coming decades. Forget about Taiwan if we're churning through tens of thousands of soldiers in Mexico. Forget about, maybe even, I think, we'd probably hold on to Israel regardless. But forget about Taiwan. Ukraine, I think the Ukrainians, the Europeans would have to actually take the brunt of defending.
Well, they are doing a lot of work there.
Not as much as the Americans are, Rory.
A lot of the, stuff on the ground, the hell of a lot of the refugees are being taken by the likes of Poland and Lithuania.
Well, that's very nice.
And I think Lithuania gave half of its military budget. I know it's very small, but it's still, Europe's still doing a lot.
Well, yeah,
but yes, it would have to step up more. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, we can leave that there and focus on Mexico. This would be this incredibly costly thing. And it would also involve, no doubt, large-scale massacres of American retiree communities further into Mexico. And if those kinds of costs were being incurred by the United States, I would expect the demands to rise. And I could see a lost decade, much like the first North American Civil War was for U.S. influence. But what was so horrifying about the first U.S. Civil War from the European context was there was this look at these stupid Americans. They thought they could rebel against us. Now they're fighting against each other. Aren't they, ridiculous? This always happens to democracy, what have you. With a very 17th and 18th century definition of what democracy is. Anyway, and then to their horror, they realized that the North, that crushed the South, that the supposedly anti-slavery British flirted very heavily with supporting. They crushed the South and in the process created an industrial war machine that was dwarfed anything that was going on in Europe. And then to the great satisfaction of the British in the 1870s and 1880s, the U.S. promptly dismantled that war machine. But I think you could see a similar dynamic if the United States got super invested in a real war, because we haven't had a real war since World War II. And you could see this war in Mexico becoming a much, much more real war.
Was that the last time America had declared a war? Because before they've essentially been special operations.
Yeah, I think, I don't know how you look at the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I think that was... I don't think the Vietnam War was sort of declared as such, like a declared war. But, Vietnam is incredibly traumatizing. That involved like 50,000, the deaths of like 50,000 U.S. soldiers. The World War II was like 400,000 U.S. soldiers. A serious U.S. war in Mexico, which nobody wants, to be clear. Like nobody, even these Republican morons, the argument that they're making for sending the special forces into Mexico is that the argument that they're making for sending the special forces into Mexico is that it'd be easy. We could take out these narco heads real quick. It'll be easy and fun, ignoring entirely the history of the reason
why they're there.
Yeah, the reason why. You looked this up. You said because of the Bush-Calderon war. Did you say that the murder rate in Mexico has quadrupled?
Yeah, 2006 homicide rate. It is 74% more than America in 2006. So it's 9.9 per 100,000 and America's was 5.7. And then when we go to 2012, it is now 4 times more. So there is 8. It's the closest I can get good data on both countries. But it shows what happened after the surge of fighting the drug war. So it's 4 times more. So 19 deaths per 100,000, while America's is at around 4.7.
And I know that's 10,000. So my understanding is that about 10,000 people died in Mexico every year in 2007, and now we're in 35,000, 40,000. So doing what the current Republicans are asking for, going in and taking out the heads of these narcotic cartels, that's what we did in 2007, and it took the number of people dying in Mexico every year from 10,000, just sort of proportional to what was happening in the United States, to something like 40,000 every year. So basically, doubling down on what has been failing since 2007 is insane and entirely ignorant. But I don't think these folks truly realize that what they're asking for is a second North American Civil War.
Or at the very least, a lot more attacks on American civilians.
Of course, of course. I think it would be something that would just very quickly get very horrific. It's interesting, for a long time, maybe this is just the sleep deprivation talking, but...
We're hitting the crash.
Indeed. For a long time, the scenario that bothered me the most was the prospect of U.S. war with Iran in the Middle East. And that was what would derail the consolidation of U.S. power.
Because from what I've heard, Iran is a proper power, similar to maybe France militarily, but it's one of those things I'm sure you could argue all night. But it's a proper power, while Iraq, not so much.
Yeah, and specifically the problem with Iran is that, there's no question of the United States being able to invade Iran.
And win.
Well, I don't think we try. There's the era when we would, try to fight wars with mass armies is probably over. The thing about Mexico is that we'd have to. Things would get bad enough.
Yeah, because it's on your doorstep.
Exactly. So,
Well, that's always, when you look at these people saying, America's a blessed country, one of the things they say is we have two fairly peaceful neighbours that don't threaten us.
Yes.
So as far as neighbours go, they're great. If you consider, when we talk about Yemen in other episodes, and also Syria, they have horrible neighbours.
Yep, they really do.
When Mexico, from what I understand, America and Mexico love each other.
Generally we do. And if you want to be conspiratorial, that's what just sort of is so troubling. It's like, if the United States wanted to destabilize Mexico and create a context in which the United States could justify an invasion, it's really hard to imagine doing anything more effective than what George W. Bush did with the Merida Initiative, and by, I would argue, probably to some extent forcing, but maybe persuading Calderon to launch this incredibly disastrous drug war back in 2006 and 2007. So it is, I don't think anybody was actually consciously thinking that way. But if the United States were to want to destabilize Mexico as a prelude to conquering it, exactly what has happened over the past 16 years is what we would have done. Exactly. It's the United States. There's so much about the way that the United States operates just on autopilot. I think there are definitely factions in Washington, D.C. who were very, very eager and happy to use Ukraine as a wedge between Russia and Europe, and very consciously acted to create the situation we're seeing now. But it's a tiny, tiny minority of people, and the vast majority just thought we were being helpful and doing the right thing the whole time. Taiwan, I think, for anybody who's read a history book, current U.S. actions around Taiwan are incredibly aggressive and incredibly destabilizing. But the vast majority of the people who are actually doing it just think we're being friends of democracy. Because it's just the way we act, sort of unthinking and unhistorically aware, and with the assumption that everybody wants to do things the way we want to do things. I think everybody in the Bush administration just thought they were being helpful by providing, now it's $3 billion to help Mexico commit this incredible act of near suicide.
If America was a friend of democracy, I'm always brought back to what you said about Tunisia, when they could have given it $5 billion to pay its debts.
We could have given them $1.5 billion as a grant, along the lines of
out of nowhere, just loose change.
Well, sure. I mean, the EU still, I believe, gives Poland if you net it out, $8 billion in grants every year. If the United States...
Well, yeah, that's one of the things about the EU. It tends to sort of focus money on the poorer regions. So you'll see a massive change. I've heard the likes of Moldova used to, joke about Romania being very poor, their tractors being rubbish. And now they're very envious when they see just the transformation. But yeah, this isn't quite how NAFTA works, it seems.
Well, no, it's just not how the United States works. Like nominally, one of the main things we've been focusing on is Arab democracy, and with $1.5 billion, like literally half of what we give Israel every year, we could have sustained Arab democracy in Tunisia, and they begged us. No, actually, nobody was begging, but it was an obvious opportunity with Tunisia for a decade, and now Tunisia's a dictatorship again.
But no arms contracts in that.
Yeah. Oh no, they got plenty of arms contracts. We definitely helped build up the Tunisian military that is now supporting the Tunisian dictator. So yeah, we're super good at that sort of thing. But yeah, so I'm not saying that there was like a conscious plot to destabilize Mexico. I'm just saying that like this stuff just keeps happening in U.S. history. It's just what we do, you know, from the Comanche to the Chinese Communist Party. This is, you know, it's just there's a lot of unity there, and some of this will come into the book that I'm writing at this point. You know, I think one of my biggest pet peeves is kind of what I'm engaging in right here, which is comparing the United States to Rome.
A classic.
It's a classic, but I think it's a little more detailed. This is how I like to, in my last book, I wrote a whole chapter talking about how ridiculous it is to compare modern history to classical history. But I'm now doing a lot of it and defending it by simply arguing that I'm doing a better job of it than other people do. But hey, you know, this is speculative. This is we're letting our freak flag fly in this episode, right, Rory?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I was thinking a lot about in the context of the United States and Mexico and NAFTA and USMC is something called the social war. I think there's probably a few Mike Duncan heads out there, folks who've made their way through the History of Rome podcast, and this will make a bunch of sense. A lot of the history of the Roman Republic was not under a framework where Italy was unified in any sense. It was actually a patchwork. Think maybe about like British India, how there were aspects of Italy that were controlled directly by the Romans, but then there were a lot of parts that were controlled by allied kings or tribes or this, that, and the other thing. And in the Roman context, some of these allies were infinitely more powerful than any Indian Raja in the 19th century. And at a certain point, I think just a few generations before the Caesar and Pompey and Brutus stuff that, you know, we all managed to imbibe, whether it's from the classics or from HBO. Just a couple generations before that, they fell into a really horrific war called the Social War, which was Rome proper, the Rome that was already in the process of conquering a lot of the Mediterranean versus their local allies who didn't feel like they were getting a fair shake. And it's fascinating dynamic to Roman history that, you know, what was it like being 20 miles from Rome and more formally independent of Rome than areas across the Mediterranean. And it was an alliance that worked really well for centuries and then all of a sudden fell apart. And I think it's instructive thinking about just dynamics like that as we move further and further into the sort of post-Cold War era or what have you. And it's interesting to me that we've consolidated power over North America in a similar way to the way that the Roman Republic consolidated power over Italy, not actually formally controlling Mexico and Canada, but the United States already controls a ton of aspects of Canadian and Mexican sovereignty without the actual context of them being part of the United States, without the actual context of them getting citizenship. Very, very different dynamic, but the question of who in Italy actually got to be a Roman citizen, I think was open, you know, throughout much of the empire period as well. So I do that's sort of what I'm thinking about. And I'm not sure if this is making any sense at all. Please stop me if it's not. But I do sort of think of NAFTA or USMC, and these are very young organizations. I think NAFTA got started
definitely by Roman standards.
Yeah. NAFTA got started in, 1994 or 1997 and has already gone through a number of iterations. And even if it's abandoned entirely, it'll be like the League of Nations, an inspiration for what comes after it. And it's fascinating to me thinking about how this dynamic might evolve. I think the chances of the United States falling into the kind of horrific war we've been discussing in this podcast are probably pretty slim. I think that hopefully the adults in the room will.
Well, it reminds me a wee bit of this invasion of Venezuela. Carry on.
Yeah. I hope that's the same dynamic. We're not actually falling
the same idiots in the room.
Well, what's scary this time is that it's a higher class of idiots.
But they're more powerful. Is that it?
Yeah. I mean, the New York Times and the Atlantic have both put out articles talking about how Mexico's president is an evil authoritarian.
Because he's slightly left-wing?
Mostly because he renationalized the oil industry that the last president privatized. That's the main thing. And it's scary, but I think we're probably going to avoid it. But what's kind of interesting is you think further and further, it's like, okay, well, we've largely incorporated the Mexican economy into this larger chunk from the 1990s through the 2020s. So what is it going to look like in the 2090s? Or is there going to be some kind of more tightly knit North American Union? Hopefully that comes about without the kind of violence we've discussed.
Could you see NAFTA expanding into more Central America?
Well, Central America and how to approach the problem of the largely failed states of Central America at this point. And Costa Rica's in Central America. It's a very happy, flourishing place because it made the very wise decision in the 1950s to not have a military. But yeah, there's a lot of really terribly failed states in Central America, and this is a problem that both Mexico and the United States have to deal with. Mexico more pressingly has to deal with.
Well, yeah, it seems to be a lot of the violence is more likely to be carried out in Mexico than in America. A lot of the, when you hear about refugees or these caravans, they're not Mexican. They're generally from these failed states as you talk about.
Yeah, sure. Broadly, Guatemalan, El Salvador, Nicaragua.
Because in comparison, Mexico's very rich to these other countries.
Exactly. Very much so. Very much so. And getting more so. And that's the great tragedy is just imagine what would have been possible if the Bush administration hadn't launched this nightmare. Just imagine, it's not at all, I used to compare Mexico to Turkey, but I think the Mexican GDP per capita is significantly higher than Turkey's. The appropriate comparison is Poland. The main thing standing in the way of Mexico's rise in living standards is this horrific narco war that they were gifted by George W. Bush. And we should stop it. We should really stop it.
And America's love for drugs?
Yeah, America's love for drugs is important, but that was a huge dynamic, famously a huge dynamic in the 1980s. I'm sure the volumes have gone up since the 1980s, but cocaine was not invented in 2007.
Oh, yes, I understand.
I know, I'm sorry. I know you understand that. I'm just, yeah.
Apparently drug cartels were funding ads to keep cannabis illegal.
That doesn't surprise me at all. So yeah, cocaine wasn't invented in 2007. It's choices around these drugs.
How to deal with it.
That have been just extraordinarily poor. And that's what's so frustrating about the current outcry to militarize things further. It's like, this was the problem. This was the great failed attempt starting 16 years ago in 2007 was to hyper-militarize the problem. And to further militarize the problem is not the right thing to do.
I'm also reminded of a documentary, I think it was a Louis Theroux. They were having prisoners and turning them into soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing the man recruiting them kept saying is, in the army, we blow stuff up and kill people. And it always just struck me as, you don't necessarily want that to be your drug policy. Like, if you want something blown up or someone killed, the US Army have got your back. But nation building, democracy, drug policy, not a great track record.
Like, I am not a pacifist, Rory. I am not against the existence of the U.S. military. I think it does serve a purpose underpinning the past 80 years of peace and security. But it is not a contradiction, and I think actually there are a lot of parallels of this through history, where the hegemon that the world security depends on can also at the same time be the greatest threat to that world's security. In fact, I'd say that's often the case. And I think the U.S. continuing to be a good hegemon that the world survives, which is much more of an open question than it was during the British Empire, the Roman Empire, what have you. A key part is the United States figuring out how to do less stupid stuff.
Because the Romans only had a couple of nukes.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, they had trouble with their centrifuges. They just could never quite get there. Never quite get there. You know, Obama did a lot of really terrible stuff, but he did have a great idea. That was actually one of his policy ideas was let's do less stupid stuff. And he did a lot of stupid stuff. He did, Libya. He did the sanctions on Iran. He did a lot of really stupid stuff that destabilized the world. But that instinct was a very good one, and I think one that we should pay more attention to, because we don't have the flexibility. The world doesn't have the flexibility to allow the United States to do as much stupid stuff as we may more naturally be inclined to.
Biden, on the whole, has he done less stupid stuff?
It's an interesting question. I'd say the jury is still out. He hasn't. There's this famous approach that, Trump didn't start any wars, which I would argue is completely inaccurate. Of course, Obama started the war in Syria, but Trump's the guy who actually put U.S. troops on the ground, and those U.S. troops are still on the ground. I think that Joe Biden's record is going to always be positive among people who read because he took us out of Afghanistan. Just an extraordinary accomplishment. But he's also kept doing a bunch of really stupid stuff. He's doubled down in Somalia. I think I talked about recently in Yemen. I think he's actually contributed to the end of the war in Yemen by not backing Saudi Arabia to the extent that Trump did. I think that's a really good thing. But he had the JCPOA, could have gotten into that. Instead, he's just maintained this incredible risk of war with Iran. I don't think Joe Biden would let an invasion of Mexico happen. I think he's smart enough to avoid it.
But it also seems incredibly pointless.
Yeah.
It feels like it's all downside. Yes, America would win eventually, but it's, at what cost?
At larger cost than World War II, I'd say for sure. For sure.
And if it does create another civil war, that's always great for, America's enemies. A nice wee civil war.
Well, you remember, I think I'd mentioned earlier, everybody in Europe laughed when the U.S. Civil War started, and laughed a lot less when they looked at...
concluded?
Yes, when it concluded and they saw how much more powerful the United States had become. But yeah, no, I agree. There's very little upside. But I don't know. I mean, what does a President Ron DeSantis look like? Ron DeSantis is famously from Florida. And there's nothing that a Florida politician hates more than a Latin American leftist. And it looks likely that Obrador... So Mexican presidents are one term. They have been ever since Porfirio Diaz. It does look likely.
I did hear that in their history they did have some that, had about 7.
Yes, Porfirio Diaz.
Mm-hmm. So they brought in a ruling to stop that. Was that the case?
The horrible thing about Porfirio Diaz is that was the principle before Porfirio Diaz. He actually pulled a Putin and stepped out of power in the earlier years of his time on top because it was unacceptable for there to be a Mexican president with more than one term. And then he just said screw it and was the president for 3 decades or something like that. But after Diaz, since 1910, 1911 or thereabouts, Mexican term presidents have been one-term presidents. But I do think that the growing sense is, and the reason that if AMLO, Obrador, had been a complete failure and was likely to get voted out in disgrace in 2024, I don't think The Atlantic or the New York Times would be writing screeds about him. I think the concern here is that he has been popular and effective enough. And this is a key thing that gets left out a lot, is he has been effective in slowing down the drug war. But he's popular and effective enough that he's going to be able to establish a more left-leaning successor. So I think that it's an open question if this, depending on how this successor brands himself, it's entirely possible that this successor could be more effectively left-wing and better at buttering up Republican and Democratic U.S. presidents. Who knows?
That's a very important thing, keeping America on side, it seems.
Indeed.
Do you think there's a threat in this? Like, obviously, there'll be Mexicans reading these papers too. government officials? Will they be saying, tone down on nationalization of other areas?
Will the Mexicans respond negatively to the volume?
Will there be policies that they would have implemented that they will maybe just say, enough of this, keep a bit more free trade to keep the Americans gathering at the border?
The problem is that Mexico is already so integrated. Biden just announced an immigration policy that's basically saying everybody stays in Mexico. That's an oversimplification. But the Mexicans are sort of like, well, I guess we just have to take it. But I do think that the U.S. can and does and has in recent years taken actions that can make the Mexicans much less cooperative. Most famously, I believe it was a Mexican admiral. Mexico has a navy, apparently. And there was a Mexican admiral who was arrested in the United States on vacation because of, alleged, I don't find this impossible to believe, connections to Mexican cartels. And that was seen by the Mexican government as unacceptable on a range of levels and really, really hurt U.S.-Mexican cooperation. And so, yeah, absolutely. There's definitely pushback. But there's the question of how far can Mexico afford to push? I think that it is a great thing that AMLO is going to be out of power at the end of 2024, I believe it is. So there'll be a new figure in power. I'm not sure anybody really knows who that figure is. It's been probably 6 months since I looked into this at all. But my understanding is that the succession is in dispute, and there will be a very real, free and fair election. I think the thing is, though, is that AMLO and his party and his successor, whoever that might be likely to win the election. So, yeah. And there's nothing that the United States hates more than a free and fair election that elects somebody we don't like.
South of their border, they're happy enough with Canadians doing it.
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine a Canadian prime minister that would be anti-American in a serious way. Perhaps in a rhetorical way. Like, wasn't Trudeau's dad? Didn't he set up? Occasionally make rhetorical forays against the United States. I don't think but I can't see not since the 1840s or so, thereabouts, has there been a serious...
Was when they burnt down the White House?
Well, that was the 18 teens, yeah. But the tensions continued for decades thereafter. But I don't think there's anybody in Canada... I mean, it's just sort of like, this is an oversimplification, but isn't like the political spectrum in Canada from those who want to work closely with the United States to those who would like to secede from Canada and join the United States. So it's not a functionally particularly independent country, and less so. Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating just thinking about what's North America going to look like a century from now. After the level of economic integration. I mean, ideally, like, we're going to get free movement, not in my lifetime probably, but by the second half of this century, there should be free movement within North America.
To me, the most obvious logistics would be, would America trust, because obviously you have Nicaragua, Honduras, would America be happy with Mexico policing that border themselves, or would there be an integrated NAFTA, coalition, and then you would have essentially American troops on the border of this NAFTA border?
That's a great question. Yeah. Like, would we get a NAFTA Frontex or something? Isn't the EU thing is Frontex?
Yeah.
So the first real EU military force is a border police.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would we get a NAFTA Frontex? That's a really interesting question. But also, as Mexico evolves over the next couple decades, like, the idea that you're going to somehow solve the drug war with arrests and special forces murders in the next couple years is ridiculous. But it could be a lot like, you remember the terrible threat of Islamic fundamentalism that we were all supposed to be so scared about forever and ever, about 20 years ago, and now largely...
It's slowly diminished.
Exactly. If we stop militarizing the drug trade and Mexico experiences the kind of extraordinary economic growth that seems almost guaranteed over the next 20 or 30 years from now, Mexico could be a nation that it could be our favorite neighbor. We could see Canada as sort of an irritating appendage compared to the vibrant, young, attractive Mexicans. I've emphasized the incredible negative, we've emphasized the incredible negatives in Mexican-U.S. relations, mostly created by George W. Bush and President Calderon of Mexico. But there are a lot of really, really, really positive aspects and increasing integration between the countries. And
But also I've seen a lot of ones kind of saying that, can't we use Mexico to do a lot of what we do with China, and we don't have to ship it around the world, and it's significantly less of a security concern?
That is a huge dynamic. I did a video about this a couple of years back, talking about what an amazing decade Mexico was going to have. And I think to some extent that's coming to fruition, especially in the aftermath of COVID.
Also, when you look at its age population, with a lot of people have been focusing on Russia, which has a dreadful next 100 years. Mexico, it's all young children. It's basically like a pyramid, which is what every country would love. A great big pile of children ready to grow up and it tapering at the top. When a lot of Western countries, there's a big blob in the middle. It's like almost like a reverse pyramid.
Yeah, it's fading. It's fading. I mean, in the 70s, every Mexican woman had like 7 kids. Now they have 2. But it is so much better.
But the future is bright.
It is so much better than sort of standard Europe or Asia. Extraordinarily better. And better than the United States, though not as extraordinarily better. The future is very bright for Mexico. The future is very bright for U.S.-Mexico integration. It's just such a goddamn shame that it was set up so violently by George W. Bush and Felipe Calderon. And it would be great if we could move further away from that. Because if we don't, we could really start talking about the real second North American Civil War.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.